Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Nobody, and I'm bringing you another installment of Making Nobody Happy. And as much as I am someone who is sometimes reluctant to take a firm and simple stance on things, I am going to take some stances here today on something. I want to talk about this as what I like to call unpacking hate speech. And so this is something that was on my mind a while back. And it was in response, in this particular case, to there was an article that was just written by an evolutionary biologist, and it referenced the difference in strength levels between men and women. Like it was just a scientific article, and it just referenced the fact that there was this differential between strength levels of males and females. And that article was actually censored by Instagram as hate speech. Um, and so that made me sit down and think a little longer about the subject. And so I just want to say some of what I have to say on the subject of hate speech. I believe people never should have generated the category of hate speech. I think it's a very weird concept. Hate is an emotion, and we aren't generally well equipped to make firm judgments about or decisions based on the alleged subjective emotional states of other people. That's why the law doesn't, up till recently, did not include things like this. It's a very slippery and vague thing to hang so much significance on. And yet we find it everywhere today. It's a cultural phenomenon. It's very hard to pin down all the meanings it has: legal, cultural, moral, psychological. It's just a word and a term that we use casually everywhere now. And I don't think it's even possible at the moment to chase down all those questions of what hate speech really means, not here at least. The more pertinent question to me is, what is its function in our society? What is the function of the concept? Simple. It's a tool. What is the tool for? How do people use it? Like all language, it has a conventional social significance based around what we use it for. So, what do we use it for? And to that, I would answer, based on my closest and most practical reading, that it's a tool for creating exceptions to the limitations we have on the regulation of speech, so that speech can be safely made the subject of moral, legal, social, and psychological force and control. It's a means for creating a special class of acts that you're able to break the usual restrictions and limitations of regulation on, because it's been classified as a special kind of act that justifies it. It's hate. It allows you to bring force to bear that you otherwise could not justify. So hate is a term we use for opinions, positions, attitudes, and actions that would normally be within the scope of your own personal discretion, but that have, because of their special status, been accepted from those freedoms and protections. And in the case of actions that would in themselves be criminal in an ordinary way, it overlays a separate secondary level of legal, moral, and psychological significance and censure. So you can have a crime, things that you do that are in themselves illegal, whereas talking isn't naturally illegal. Having feelings isn't naturally illegal. But there's some things that you do that are illegal, and then we can also lay on top of that this extra significance, this secondary layer of legal and moral significance that we can then bring extra power to bear. So that is the functional definition or diagnosis that I have of hate. That's how we use it. Moreover, because hate is a subjective psychological state, it allows us to bring to bear the forces of moral, social, and legal censure against people purely on the basis of their subjectivity, on the basis of who they are, or who we impute them to be, people possessing a hateful internal state. It allows certain ways of being and any expressions that might indicate that way of being to be expressly forbidden from the outset. You can't be that. You can't think that. You can't believe that. And because it's such an inherently subjective designation, it has enormous flexibility in its potential use. So the fact that this article that I referred to earlier was classified as hate speech to the point that it actually fell afoul of systemic regulation and actual censorship shows just how much force the term hate allows you to bring to bear. The use of the term is far more revealing of its nature than anything else people have to say about it. It's so powerful that it's kind of amazing, and it can be wielded with remarkably arbitrary and unquestionable power. Just like that, you can get a scientific article, one containing virtually no emotion, whose claims are perfectly verifiable, pulled off a public platform as hate speech. So the whole concept is a social and legal doomsday weapon. And we're only just now starting to take it seriously when we see the beginnings of just what can be done with it. Because the answer is, as this case should demonstrate, almost anything. A better functional definition of hate speech would be speech that I hate, that I can therefore bring social, legal, and moral force against, specifically on that basis. And you don't necessarily even need another basis. It's a sufficient basis. Because its central concept is subjective, its application is also fundamentally subjective. That isn't a moral argument, it's a technical fact. Hate is in the eye of the beholder, and the only real limit on diagnosis is how easily some determinative quorum are moved to feel it. So that's a case of, like with many of the hate laws you see coming in now, it's not determined by any external qualification, but just by someone personally. It's in the eye of the beholder, essentially. That's entirely sufficient. So the central irony of hate speech is that it tells you far more about the emotions of the accuser than the accused. And that, I think, has always been its nature, for better or for worse. We don't condemn hate speech because it's hateful, but because we hate it. So this is a little postscript, and I'm going to have a few postscripts here. So it's easy to suppose that when we imagine the potential consequences of such cases, that we overstate their practical potential, their practical consequences. It seems really awful from an ideological standpoint, but not such a big deal from a practical standpoint. It's not really a big deal. It's just a silly little paper being censored, as if ideology and what we do in public society had no impact on the actual behaviors we'll eventually exhibit in our own lives and in our own freedoms, and what we'll be able to do or not do, or what can be said or not said. People don't just talk or think in a purely idle manner. They're generating simulations. They're playing mental games as practice for real ones. But mental games are often limited by their real-world applicability. You might have ideas that are very hard to implement or that few other people share. But when enough people share an idea, and it takes a lot fewer people than you would think, ideas begin to spill over into practice. A culture develops new rules of what's possible. Like, it doesn't take that many people to believe in something in a culture for it to become the reality of that culture, the water that you swim in, the day-to-day experience. So in countries with fewer protections for speech, like China or Singapore, you can have the police show up your door for a comment you made on social media. It's happened many times. But the same now also holds true for countries like Scotland and Australia and Canada. You need to be careful what you say, because you might run afoul of the law. And I don't mean for bomb threats, I mean for unacceptable speech or liking a video or a tweet that violates hate crime standards. Speech like that in this article, something that seems fairly benign, but has become a possible object of censorship. People can and do already now lose their jobs and see their lives and careers assaulted and censored and punished. This isn't hyperbole. This is already happening every single day in places like England. The leap from social censure to outright legal punishment is one that is becoming easier and easier to make. Already in England, Canada, Australia, and Scotland, it's being made. Cases have already begun to trickle in. Precedents are being set. Far from being subject to more social censure, Failing to use preferred pronouns in Canada has now, in an actual court case, been declared a legal violation of human rights and subject to legal consequences and enforcement. In fact, it was deemed a crime against humanity. Not that the case it was used in was a wonderful case, but you still have to look at the outcome and the rulings and the precedents that are being set. So why? Why? Because the legal structures were put into place, making it possible a few years ago. Social structures against hate speech were given legal powers. Matters of personal speech are now governed by legal force and criminal punishment. And once that door is open, it's open. Speech itself has become a legitimate matter for government regulatory control. The problem we often encounter when we create and take hold of such novel structures and powers is we don't really have a clear idea what it is that we've just made possible. We imagine the possible uses of our inventions through very limited and rosy glasses, and we neglect their real potential, as well as what a difference a little time will make. These things always take time. So the fact that this particular scientific article could be classified as hate speech and removed from public viewing is a warning that we have unleashed powers that have already evolved beyond our control or expectations. And the leap from social punishment to legal punishment is only a matter of adding a few legal structures and removing a few legal limitations. A leap that's already being taken all over the Western world. Now, it might be alarmist to point this out, but if I am being alarmist, it's only because what we're seeing happening is alarming. And the barriers holding things back from becoming even more consequential are far less substantial than we imagine them to be. In fact, they're already growing so thin that they're being pierced in dozens of places. Now, I could end there, but I actually want to go on because this is something where I've already had some back and forth with someone on this subject. I had someone raise concerns about the necessity of these sorts of protections, and I wanted to give my 2 cents on the subject of protections and to what degree they should be legal protections with the force of the law behind them, to what degree we're willing to give up certain areas for having legal power applied against them. So, as someone who spent years taking quite a bit of verbal and physical abuse, I can guarantee they're both quite unpleasant. But there is a massive difference in how we treat that legally. Even with my kids, there's a big difference between calling someone names and physically hitting your sibling. No one denies that subjective states matter and words matter. They're just such things that are much easier to regulate legally, and some things you should take the greatest pains not to regulate, not with legal punitive force, except in the most extreme and limited of circumstances, and speech is one of those things. So that's just my personal opinion on why speech itself actually does belong to a protected class. It's not just like hitting someone. It's not the same thing as just physical violence. Yes, it is emotionally troubling, and I know that it's emotionally troubling. But there's some things we have to be very careful about placing controls over because it's dangerous to do so. So having brought that up, I did have someone say, well, what about the fact that you can't shout fire in a crowded theater? Like that's a precedent for regulating speech. And so I would say, yes, the fire example just goes to show how careful we have been historically about any restriction of speech. We restrict speech in that case because it could directly result in an immediate panic, causing dozens of people to be trampled to death. That's a pretty extreme case for which we make a tiny, tiny little exception. And we do still have to often tell people there's a fire here. We just have certain ways of doing it. You know, we have our way. There's still communication, but we don't say, oh, well, we're never going to tell you that there's a fire in a theater, because sometimes there might be a fire in a theater. You just have to be careful about how you do it and not doing it frivolously. But we're very, very careful. That's like the one example. That's like the only example one of the very few anyone can come up with, and people are smart. They understand that there is actually a difference and some distance between that and other cases. So that's a pretty extreme case for which we make a tiny exception, and it's really more of a joke than a real thing that anyone is actually worried about. It's not like there's any actual pending cases about that. So even to get some minor restrictions on what people say about health products on their packaging required, and this is going back to how I believe the FDA was started. So just to get some minor restriction placed on what people can say about health products on their packaging required a bunch of children to be poisoned first. If you read the story of how the FDA first came to be. And now we make tons of exceptions with lots of loopholes, and even create complete exemptions for some products like herbs and supplements, so they can be free to say whatever they want. So they don't have to undergo the same sort of testings. We make exceptions for the regulation of even silly things like that. And comparatively, the difference between echinacea and being able to talk, if I had to pick which one I wanted to retain, it wouldn't be a difficult choice. So having been on the receiving end of a lot of poor treatment, I do have a real sense of the value of these freedoms. Some freedoms just can't be safely curtailed, at least not by the government. Some things should be left in the hands of the people. Some forms of agency and, yes, consequence are too important and too weighty to give up. Given the option, I wouldn't wish for things to have been different for my own sake. I don't want more things criminalized, especially essentially human and subjective interpersonal experiences, even if it means that I had some bad ones. That's the case, the person who's like, I disagree with what you have to say, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it. They've made a bargain there, saying, well, this was important enough that actually, even to protect myself from having to hear that, I'd rather have you have the right to say it than the possibility that neither of us could. So often when I was being physically mistreated, the one freedom that I still had literally was speech. And I used it to fight back. I used it as a way to fight back. Because although I couldn't physically stop what was happening to me, that didn't mean that those people could make me feel bad about it. I had that Socratic internal reserve. They couldn't stop me from telling them what I thought about what they were doing, including the fact that I wasn't impressed by what they were doing. Now, doing that probably brought me even more punishment, because people don't like sass when they're trying to break you. They expect you to grovel or at least act distressed. The fact that I never gave my persecutors satisfaction and made use of my freedom of speech made me a perpetual challenge for them. Now, having been subject to regular verbal abuse during that same period of around 8 years, I can also say that's part of why I'm against bringing the law into such things. It's just not the right domain for these powers and solutions. Some things have to be left in human hands to figure out and struggle through. You can't legally compel people to respect or like or even be kind to one another. If you try to force them by law, it doesn't work. You create a sort of bizarre, fearful, performative mechanism, a facsimile, Pharisaism, and it becomes terribly hard to control. It runs away with itself. It precludes real human interaction in an area that's just too precious to mess with. Not because it doesn't matter, but because it matters too much. It's not easy to describe how and why controlling speech doesn't work. It's worth learning about countries that have gone down the road of policing language, not just in a personal, human, or social sense, but legally. It all sounds good. It's sold as a good thing, as an act of kindness and safety and protection and promotion of the common good. But it just always goes terribly, terribly wrong. It's a classic pitfall. Some powers are just too extreme for us to wield responsibly with something as clunky as government. And there's something particularly wonderful about the freedom that we all gain from having speech be free of government control. As Americans, it's very easy to take the wonderfulness of that freedom for granted because we've never missed it. But by the time you get into a situation where you do miss it, you've already let things go too far to object. And that's all I have to say for today. We'll see you next time.